Alright guys, sorry I can't be here today. I have to stay home with my son. The plan is to go ahead and finish the notes out that you need to have, which will basically take you to the bottom of the first outline on the back side. So the whole front and back will be covered on this quiz. The plan is for the sub to go ahead and do the Kahoot with y'all after. The instructions we'll read for the sub to make sure that if you're going to use your phone or computer, make sure that you do it the right way. Don't get off and play around. If any of that happens, then the sub has permission to shut down Kahoot, and you're just going to have to read or do work quietly until the bell rings. So make sure that that you get the notes you need to get, and then the Kahoot's going to be is done in class. I'm also going to send the Kahoot out via Remind, so you'll be ready for the quiz on Tuesday. But quiz is still happening Tuesday for U.S. history. All right, so we left off Friday with the Vietnam growing a lot of discontent back home. We talked about the draft. We talked about African Americans in Vietnam. So the draft was very unpopular because a lot of folks didn't want to go. They didn't see a reason to be going to the draft. African Americans were going at an unfair rate. 10% of the population were male African Americans in the United States, but yet the military had 20% African American males. As we were talking about on Friday, it's because a lot of the people who were forced to go to the draft were working class or lower income, people who are in poverty, not the middle, not the upper classes as much because they can go to college and get out of the draft. So you do see a disproportionate amount of African Americans serving in Vietnam, more so than they should because of that reason. For women, we also briefly spoke about women. Women still cannot serve in combat, but they could serve in the military in other capacities, nurses, working as clerks, secretaries, whatever, but they just still cannot do combat at this point. All right, so this should be new for everybody. And again, if there's anything that you feel like is not well covered, I can briefly go over it before the quiz on Tuesday. That's not a problem. These notes will also be made available on YouTube, so I'll put them out at the end of the day. If that way you need to hear it again to get something you missed, but the quiz will still happen on Tuesday no matter what. All right, roots of opposition. We're going to talk about today the notes and then wrap up for the review is how a lot of younger people are protesting this war and explain why they're protesting this war. So, college campuses became centers for anti-war protests. So that's something to be aware of. That a lot of college campuses, a lot of college-age people were the ones who were protesting the war, protesting the government, which makes a lot of sense because these are the guys who are draft eligible, draft age, 18, 26-year-olds. So the people in colleges, this is where the most people who protest the war came from. And not just the war, but also the government itself and so on. Many of the anti-war college students came from middle class because these are the ones who are in college or upper classes. So college campuses became the center for anti-war protests. Many of the anti-war college students came from middle class. Early in the war, there were professors who supported the war at first, but as the war grew on, more and more professors, including the students, were against it. Students were kind of not really great about it at first, but every year the war goes on and they see how bad it is. Students protest more and more, and then eventually a lot of the professors and leaders of the colleges do too. These young people who protest the war were referred to as the New Left, and I'd be aware of that phrase. The New Left refers to these young, very liberal protesters who are against the war and against the government getting too involved in their life. So why is it called the New Left? The left usually refers to being liberal in politics. So the old left would be like the 1930s New Deal Democrats, where the government's huge and it does a lot of programs. So in this case, while they want a lot of rights, like they want African American rights, women's rights, the right not to go to war, the right to vote at a younger age, they want all those rights, but they don't want the government too invasive in their lives with things like the draft or fighting wars they feel like are unfair. The New Left is defined as a white student movement that advocated for democracy, civil rights, and college reforms. So the New Left is defined as a white student movement that advocated for democracy, civil rights, and college reforms whenever they're also protesting the Vietnam War too. So that's kind of who we're talking about here. College-age kids, people who are protesting because they're most likely to go fight in these wars. They're the ones who are having a lot of problems. All right, so two groups you want to be aware of. First group is the Students for a Democratic Society, SDS. Students for a Democratic Society. So that's a group you want to be aware of, is the Students for a Democratic Society. The first one was founded at the University of Michigan. So the first one was founded at the University of Michigan. SDS starts off as a way to protest racism and poverty at first, and then it later became against the Vietnam War. So SDS was a way to protest racism and poverty at first, and then later becomes this, because they're already organized, already protesting, it later becomes this group that will protest the Vietnam War. SDS starts in Michigan, but it was spread to more campuses. A lot of campuses eventually had a chapter, like a club of SDS. They organized teach-ins, which were kind of like sit-ins, where they would basically not have class and try to shut the school down so they could protest the war. They also had college professors as well as students lead demonstrations against the war. I mean, a lot of these guys now are like older baby boom types who are maybe still around in politics. I mean, Bernie Sanders himself, who's running for president, he was alive during all this and was a teenager, young person during the 60s crises, and he was a part of a lot of this protest in the 60s on campuses. So SDS wanted to reduce the power and influence of corporations in large government. SDS wanted to reduce the power and influence of corporations in large government. They wanted to reduce the power and influence of corporations in large government. Okay, so that's SDS, which you want to be aware of. The other college group that forms is called the Free Speech Movement. So the other group that forms is called the Free Speech Movement. This one starts at UC Berkeley, so University of California at Berkeley. So UC Berkeley is where this one starts. The Free Speech Movement was a massive act of civil disobedience. The Free Speech Movement was a massive act of civil disobedience on college campuses in the 60s. It's a massive act of civil disobedience on college campuses in the 60s. Students wanted campuses to lift the bans on on-campus political activities. So if you don't know this, colleges were a lot more restrictive of students' rights. They still kind of saw them like as high school kids or like as children, not as like grown adults going to college. So there's a lot of severe limitations. So during the Vietnam War, during the 60s, a lot of students wanted to protest and do a lot of things, but they were like, no, that's not the place for this. So they basically banned any kind of rights for students to protest, which just led to them kind of protesting more and trying to shut the college down. Well, eventually what ends up happening is that the free speech movement with all these protests gets a lot of college campuses to designate an area for free speech. So if you go like LSU, right in front of their union, it's called Free Speech Alley, because that was the designated area developed back in the 60s for like, if you wanted to protest, that's where you had to do it. You couldn't go like anywhere on campus and protest because that's where class is happening, but you had a designated area. So you do see colleges change because of student protests, demanding rights and demanding change to happen on campus. The last thing I have on this screen is campus activism. So SDS and the free speech movement quickly spread to other campuses. What you want to understand in the 60s is that the protest movement doesn't start with Vietnam, because at first when Vietnam breaks out in 64, 65, most Americans are okay with it. Even young people weren't that against it at first. It takes a few years for that to happen. When the 60s hit, a lot of these young kids want to change some of the rules and regulations on campuses. Like there were colleges that would require you to go to ROTC and be in a ROTC for a minimum of 2 years. So if you went to LSU, you were required by the school standards to go to ROTC for 2 years. Now you didn't have to join the military, but you had to at least be enrolled in it if you were a male for 2 years. There's a lot of restrictions on like dorms, like boys couldn't go to girls' dorms and vice versa. Things like that. There were strict curfews on college campuses, dress codes even. So dress codes, curfews, dorms, there's a lot of strict requirements and ROTC requirements. So that's kind of how the student protest of the 60s begins. It starts off as kids protesting these all these strict campus restrictions, and by the mid to late 60s, they begin to get colleges to relax on their rules. And since they're already organized and protesting, it becomes very natural, since they're all very young, to simply over time roll into protesting also the Vietnam War. So by 67, 68, SDS, free speech movement, they're all out there protesting big time against Vietnam and wanting the government to get us out. They're against the politicians, especially once they find out more and more about the government basically lying or not telling the full truth. People are getting drafted, don't want to get drafted. And so obviously all that plays into all this. So we're going to stop the first video there. We'll have one more video, and then it'll be it before your